going to be zooming in on a number of different issues, such as the common challenges we face when leading commercial innovation. We're going to be looking at some of the mindsets that are conducive to change and how we can cultivate those, how we will develop systems that support change, and finally, and I think very importantly, the role of human capacity development and adult learning in helping companies to embrace change. You can see that this is the second of three topics. Our next topic will be in just over a month's time, where we'll be zooming in on navigating market access, which was an important part of the Burkina Drymore project. Today, we are joined by some very experienced and I think quite insightful guests. We have Michiel Arnoldus, who is the Managing Director at Sense. It's a development consultancy based in Ireland and in South Africa that delivers advisory and implementation services across Africa. We're also joined by Marlon Henneke, who has over 25 years of experience in change management. He brings a very fresh perspective on this topic. I think very often we concern ourselves with systems change. Marlon allows us to explore some of the more granular aspects of change and innovation. And finally, we are joined by Bernardo Sousa, the Program Director for Burkina Drymore, and brings his experience from Advanced Consulting. He's been working in several emerging markets on a range of topics, from innovation through funding. He's worked in renewable energy, the agri-food sector, and so on. Now, of course, these guests are important, but they are not our VIPs. Our VIPs today are, of course, you, the development practitioners who have dialed in for this call. You'll have opportunities throughout the call to either participate in the chat. You should have already inserted something in the chat, so that will get that going. There'll be one or two polls along the way. Some of you have already participated in a poll prior to the call. And of course, in the Q&A, we invite you to share not only your questions, but also some perspectives and perhaps even responses to the panel, to the various topics. Now, as we begin, I would ask you to share in the poll, what do you think of when you hear commercial innovation? That should pop up any second, allowing you to share that. Great, it's in the chat right now. It's part of a poll function. If you can just say, what do you think of what comes to mind when you think of commercial innovation? It could be a word, it could be a specific project, some sort of idea of what it means potentially, perhaps even your physical response, your sense of enthusiasm or fear, trepidation, and so on. So we see a couple of responses popping up. We see things like new products. Absolutely, commercial innovation does have this connection to new products, which is quite exciting. Absolutely, value, commercial innovation. Why would you innovate if it's not going to allow you to either create or protect value? We're seeing things like progress. Thank you very much. That is a very powerful concept, and one that is, I think, quite inspiring to all of us as development practitioners. Some other topics that are popping up are product improvements and new products. So we can see different ends of that spectrum. Commercial innovation, it turns out, is not a very singular idea. We've got business models, creativity, market access. So indeed, we can see that commercial innovation can exist in very many, I guess, on a spectrum and heading in different directions. And it's going to be quite interesting to explore this topic a little further. So we're going to be digging in a little bit more into this idea of commercial innovation. I know that we want to leap in very often. I'm very action-oriented myself, so I love to get to the meat of it. But before we do that, let's lay some very firm foundations. We're talking about commercial innovation as if it is already a very perfectly clear concept, one that is universally understood and understood in the same way. We're also speaking of it as if it has a very natural place in the world of development. So let's address that little elephant in the room first. We're going to turn to one of our panelists, Bernardo, with the hope of just unpacking this concept a little bit further. So, Bernardo, I hope you're ready. If you could help us, what to you is commercial innovation? What does it mean and what does it entail?
Hello, everybody. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you all, speaking from Maputo. For me, commercial innovation is all about the value. That's the word that I put in the word cloud, and the value to the customer and the value to the company, right? The new products, the new business models, the new services, all have this goal of creating value, because there is no innovation, or there is research, there's development. We can come up with new products, with new ideas, but if they don't create value for the customers and for the company performance, then it's just nice ideas, right? It doesn't have a world practice to then be deployed. So I think this is for me, this is the key where it starts. Commercial innovation, you need to start with that concept.
So I think that's quite powerful, this idea of creating value. And I think that when we gave the audience an opportunity to participate, I got a real sense of either new products or essentially renovating existing products. So I wonder if you could help me, what counts as innovation, particularly in the field of development? Are we looking for revolutionary changes? Is that innovation? Are we looking for, I don't know, smaller, more bite-sized changes? What for you counts?
I think we can, well, there is a wide spectrum, as we also saw from the World Cloud on the right. It can be a revolutionary idea that really has a significant impact. If we think about M-Pesa in Kenya with the mobile money, and how that has significantly changed how people do business in Kenya, but then it expanded to other countries in the continent, and then even it became an innovation in more developed markets, right? But then these ideas don't come often. Otherwise, it would be easy to do, which is not. So I think a lot of what we see as in advanced consulting is a lot of the companies that we work with, they are doing bite-sized innovations, small improvements, and it's a continuous process as well, where you can launch a product, but then it's not about only the new product, it's how you distribute it, what type of financing solutions you offer, how you market it. And so all of these can be divided in subsets of innovation. And you need all of those to then be successful and really reach that value for yourself, for the company, and for the customers.
I think you mentioned something which I think is quite, I found quite interesting, quite intriguing, is this idea that the big ideas don't come around all that often. And I think there's definitely some truth in it. But I wonder how easy it is to actually spot that this is a big idea that you've got in your hands. I always think that even those revolutionary ideas start off as a little seed. So I wonder how we can spot which ones are big, or is it just a trial and error kind of situation? Do you have any perspectives on that?
Yeah, for me, it would be the latter. It would be a trial and error. Yeah, obviously there's ideas that from the get-go can seem seem tempting and seem revolutionary, but until you try it, right? Also because we are talking in the development field about markets that are not easy to operate in, right? There's a lot of constraints. The enabling environment is not conducive to innovation most of the time. There's a lot of barriers, and so you really need to test your idea to that market. And we also see that there's a lot of replication of ideas. You don't need to have like a revolutionary idea by yourself, right? There's a lot of things already happening. But then you also need to see how adapted it is to the local context, because if it's successful in Kenya, it doesn't mean it's successful in Burkina Faso, right? And if it's even more difficult, successful in the Netherlands is not success in in Burkina Faso. So all of these adaptation, and then you can have a great idea, but then it's all how it interlinks these different small innovations. Because even M-Pesa, that I think would be a great example. I'm sure that's when it was being developed, they had to test a lot of things. They probably failed in the approaches, and they had to readapt until it became the success that nothing starts as a revolutionary idea by itself. I think it's also about how you implement it.
And I guess, if you look at, I think one of the key lessons we're learning from IT and innovation in the IT space is this idea of failing quickly, right? So find an idea, scope it out, yes, do all of the preparatory research, but it really only is an idea when it's in the world. You can only really know if it's going to work and scale when it's in the world. So I think that's quite exciting. And I know that often one of my observations of having moved from the private sector and big multinationals to the field of development is often we think that we need these big chunky theories of change, big chunky projects. But actually, often the progress comes in these small bite-sized ideas, making something a little bit more efficient, preparing somebody a little bit better for change.
Absolutely. I fully agree. And indeed, the development projects usually have these big concepts behind and how everything is supposed to fall in line. And I think a little bit that what could be learned from the private sector is indeed try it out, see what works, and then move to the next idea. But also it's important to monitor that, right? And to have the resources to be able to really understand what is the reasons behind the failures and to adapt. And I think there's some interesting examples out there of projects that have managed to successfully do that, so that we can learn quickly and adapt. And I think it's all about that. You cannot know from 3 years in advance or 4 years in advance, right? Burkina Drymore. We started the project, or we started designing the project, and then COVID came, and then we launched it right at the beginning of COVID. And then obviously all the security issues in Burkina Faso exacerbated in the last few years. So obviously we also needed to make the necessary changes. And luckily we had also a financier, a donor, the Dutch embassy in Ouagadougou, that was flexible enough to understand the constraints and to support us in that. And I think that's something that indeed needs to be more common in these development projects.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's quite interesting. Now, of course, we're talking about commercial innovation, right? And that, by definition, involves the private sector in some way. And I can almost hear some of our more purist colleagues saying, but what on earth does development have to do with private sector innovation? Surely private sector must innovate. Private sector must invest. What would your perspective on that be? Either, do you agree? Do you disagree? Why?
No, I think, for me, for advanced consulting, right, we are focused on the private sector. And for us, it makes a lot of sense to work in this space also with the investment, with the impact angle, right, and the development angle. Because most of all of our clients are carrying out these activities, these innovations, but also with the mindset that they want to create impacts. They want to reduce poverty, they want to create jobs, they want to make the use of resources more sustainable, and they are actually achieving that. And I don't think it should be a competition between different approaches. I think it's complementary, right? The commercial innovation is important, as would be important public sector reforms or civil society approaches. There's a lot of things that the commercial innovation cannot do by itself, but I think it does have a strong role to play in this. And we have worked with many companies, for example, one that is distributing solar water pumps, that have piloted also with pay-as-you-go capabilities, SunCulture. They are doing interesting work in how to really scale up these types of products that are very expensive for an individual farmer, and how to create the models and the financing structures to be able to make it more affordable and more accessible for these for farmers. So I do think it has a strong role to play.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. You know, I spent probably a decade helping large international global brands developing purposeful brand positionings. And, you know, on one hand, you can look at it and say, oh, that's all greenwashing. But on the other hand, they really did bring some very important human issues, developmental issues to the fore. And when I think about the scale of the investment, these companies, even if they invest 1 or 2% of their global marketing spend in some of these challenges that we find in different communities around the world, you can have a massive impact on water, on sanitation, on healthcare. You know, we ran programs, everything from investing in saving the tigers to soap for washing hands in rural communities. So we can definitely see how sometimes the interests of the private sector and the interests of the public sector actually the benefit, the value for both parties. So perhaps this is a great opportunity to bring our other development practitioner into the discussion. So that would be Michiel Arnoldus. Michiel, would you mind just perhaps lending us a perspective on this topic, you know, about the role of development and development practitioners in commercial innovation?
Sure. I think what we have to keep in mind is that in the end of the day, if we want to have lasting impact, we need to create some form of income, that pays for all of the good ideas. And that means we need to have access to a market. And I think the biggest challenge that we have is we were always trying to innovate in this sector, in the development sector, whether it is an innovative business model, innovative technology, an innovative way of doing things, thinking about how we can involve youth or women. But in the end of the day, the question is still, what is the economic incentive for people who don't have a lot of money to be hobbying around with nice ideas? What is their incentive to do it, to implement it, to keep doing it? So you need to have access to a market somehow that pays for doing these great ideas. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. So we can have a great solar pump, but if the solar pump doesn't make the farming more profitable, it's not going to be used, and the innovation will not succeed. And I think we do also have to keep in mind that innovation, it could be a product, it could be a business model, it could be a technology. But in the end of the day, it actually also comes back to what Bernardo said earlier about value. And I think that's what is the value for the user, what's the value for the client, how are we using this innovation to make things better?
Yeah, so how can we find first of all this alignment of interests? How can we multiply the effects? And I often think to myself about the resources that are available in the private sector, the human capacity that's available in the private sector, there's process. And so often we forget that if there's anyone in the system that needs to change, that needs to innovate, it's the private sector. Without it, they won't survive. They will definitely not thrive. So I definitely see how bringing these two seemingly different worlds, how they can work together so beautifully. So of course, now we've been talking about lessons from Burkina Drymore. I think this is a wonderful opportunity for us to just dig a little deeper into that program. For those of you who are not aware, the Burkina Drymore program was a program specifically designed to assist dried mango producers in Burkina Faso in diversification. In many instances, these factories are in production for, let's say, about 4 to 6 months of the year, depending on the length of the season, meaning that these very expensive production facilities are left empty, and the staff who work in those facilities are unemployed for most of the year. This was an opportunity thus to drive this diversification, which would have a knock-on effect for livelihoods of farmers, as well as for the employees in those businesses. So, Michiel, if you could help us to understand,
Sure.
what was it about Burkina Drymore that was innovative?
So I think what we've tried to do is really follow the innovation funnel, as they call it in the private sector. And the innovation funnel means that you start with a lot of ideas on the top, and you very quickly try to sort out what can work, what doesn't work, and end up with a few winners. And then during the program, you'll see that maybe in the end you've got one or two things that win in the end, right? So I think for us, the main question was, what other products can we add to dried mango that use the same technology and or have the same type of clients and or the same farmers, so that we have some economies of scope, of scale, and we can benefit from existing client relationship, existing supplying relationship, existing infrastructure such as dryers. But they still need to be profitable, and they need to have a different season than mango, right? So that's how we started. So I think we had a long list of 10 or 15 products where we started calling importers, looking at existing market research, doing some quick calculations and trying to figure out, okay, which of these products can actually work. And in some cases, there were even things that we've tried in the past, right? So if you're thinking about dried mango, then you think to yourself, well, why not dried banana, dried papaya, dried pineapple? But a lot of the things that we had tried in the past and they were not profitable. The pineapple is too far away. The transport costs are too high. Banana, the market is not really there. Papaya's got no flavor when you dry it. So if you have to add sugar and, then you cannot compete with Asia because their sugar is much cheaper and you're essentially selling sugar and not so much fruit. Papaya is also always expensive. So these ones were already discarded from the start because we tried those years ago. And then I think what we ended up with was an interesting combination of ginger, dried and sliced ginger, which goes into a spice market. We had hibiscus, which is a flower that goes mostly into teas, actually. So in West Africa, it's used as a separate drink, but it actually mostly goes into fruit teas. So when you have this lovely strawberry flavored tea, that strawberry flavored tea is not red because of the strawberries, it's red because of the hibiscus they add in. Mm-hmm. And then we had fonio, which is basically the quinoa of Africa, or should we say that quinoa is the fonio of Latin America. Mm-hmm. So these were three interesting kind of products that we started working with, and that was a matter of really doing the cost price calculations, looking for the market, and trying to figure out what are the main challenges, because you also have to work along the whole value chain. You have to look into farming because it needs to be available cheaply for the factory. Then you have to look into processing. How do you make it? And then into the marketing side, how do you bring it to market? And I think in that, and somewhere in that, you have to bring the processor within your innovation funnel, in your innovation approach. And I think somewhere in that process, we may have bitten off more than we could chew, I have to admit. It was fairly challenging, particularly in the environment in Burkina. But that was a little bit the approach. And it's also an approach that some countries have successfully used. So Chile is a very good example of a country where they tried to find things that worked. And they tried a lot of things, 10, 20 different things. And in the end, I think they ended up with wine and salmon and one or two other products in which they are really, really good and really strong now. So yeah, it was really that innovation funnel approach.
Mm-hmm. So that is, I think, quite interesting. Again, private sector bringing a solution that could be very useful and powerful in unlocking development and progress in development. Tell me, I'm quite curious, you talk about some of business, it almost sounds like you're using business metrics. So how could you be certain that these ideas had, I guess, a real business case?
Yeah, so that's a matter on the one hand of gathering the data, benchmarking, seeing what they do in other countries, and then running lots of tests, right? So if you take dry ginger, for example, in any kind of drying, the main question is always how much fresh products at which price do you need for 1 kilogram of dried product? And then how much electricity and gas and man hours do you need to put in to create that product? What is your cost price recipe? That is the most important part, right? Now, then you can have certain things based on experience. If you know that the dry ginger dries in 6 hours and I know what 24-hour drying cost I can estimate, we only need a quarter of the gas that you use for mango. But in the end of the day, you need to get the companies to do lots of trial and error, lots of testing. So you're letting them do a production run and you measure. This is how much gas we started with at the beginning. This was my electricity counter. We're weighing how much ginger we are buying, and in the end, we're weighing how much product do we get out. We're looking how much gas do we use. We put the gas bottles back on the scale, and that is how you get information. And then you also have to see how much can you learn from experience, because the first time you do something, you're not very good at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to maybe do something for 6 months or a year to get to the end result. So ginger, for example, maybe you use 6 kilograms, but you can do 4 kilograms in the end. And there's also scientific calculations you can do. You know what is the moisture content of fresh ginger, you know what is the moisture content of the final product, and then you can simply calculate what the conversion factor should be. So all of these things you can do to make an estimate. But the proof is of the pudding is in the eating. So you do need the companies to do a lot of testing.
And I think this is quite interesting, just in this short while, you've mentioned innovativeness on multiple levels. There's the innovation around the approach, using the innovation funnel. You've spoken about a certain market orientation and really understanding the opportunity in the market, the newness of the product themselves. You've spoken about this need to do trial and error, processing tests. You've spoken about a little bit about the market. And I think you've given us a hint that perhaps the entrepreneurs weren't always with you. So I guess my question is knowing that the innovation is so meaty, it's so big, how did the companies receive it, and how able were they to participate in the innovation as partners?
Yeah, that was very difficult, to be honest. And I think we really overestimated maybe their appetite or their ability to innovate. And I think looking back on it, we were dealing with companies that had been in that market for 10, 15, 20 years, very happily doing one product. And they were very comfortable with that product. And then their expectations of any other products were maybe fairly unrealistic. If your expectation is that you can run a 40% gross margin on a new product from day one, then it's going to be very difficult to convince somebody to say, listen, here's a product and you're going to get only 15%, but at least it keeps you busy the rest of the year. They kind of get it, but they're not, to get them to buy in is not so easy. So it's really difficult to get them active and start doing the trial and error. It's almost like the expectation is, okay, this is a new product and we're going to do it and it's going to work from day one. And this idea that it's a process, it takes time, that you need to invest in. Maybe it's also something that we didn't explain sufficiently at the start, looking back on it, but it is really difficult to bring them with you on that journey. I think, and we also saw that, I think we alluded to that last week around the equipment, right? The expectation is I have a new machine, I plug in the machine and it will work perfectly from day one. It's not like that with agricultural processing. You have to learn how to work with the machine. You have to, over time, get better as you gain experience, as your operators learn. You have to learn how to maintain the machine and how to feed product into the machine and all of these kind of things. So I think there's a lot of expectation management that should be done. And I think there's a lot more needed to get people with you. I think people were quite passive. They were kind of waiting for stuff to happen instead of taking a very active role sometimes.
So I think it's going to be quite interesting to explore what was behind this passive, seemingly passivity of the companies. But I guess my question to you is, if you could do it all over again, what would you do differently?
I think, first of all, I think in the selection of the companies, I would go for younger, less established businesses that have a more innovative character. In general, I find in selection of beneficiary and product, we focus a lot on the stuff that they have. Do they have a big factory? Do they have a market? Do they have a financial backing? Do they have a history? But then you sometimes end up with not very innovative mindsets, right? People that are not very open to change, they're very comfortable where they are. So that would be the first step. The second step, I think, would be to really do a lot of expectation management and really see, okay, this is a trajectory. How can we take them along in the journey with us? And what are maybe the mindsets and what are the blockages to them to change? And do they really have a burning platform or idea to change, or are they actually fairly happy where they are? So I think we would have to work a lot more with the entrepreneurial mindset, and not so much expect that we're going to be doing something interesting, they will come along.
Definitely given us some insights that it's not easy, right? And I think that we're getting a sense that at its heart, commercial innovation really is about leading change, particularly if we're going to successfully lead commercial innovation. What I'm hearing from some of the discussions with Bernardo earlier is that sometimes that quantum of change is large and revolutionary. Other times it involves repurposing existing technologies, sharpening up on some processes, but ultimately it is change that creates value. Now, I have to say our field of development is very much aware of the idea of change. After all, theories of change are our bread and butter. And nearly every organization we encounter has some notion of change and how they drive change. We've seen in working with CBI, for example, we've seen the BEAM model. When we work with the Irish, it's food systems development, food systems transformation pathways. And then there are a host of other custom models that are designed for each individual intervention for good reason. I think what we're also starting to get is that perhaps we are very concerned with systems interventions, as we should be, right? We know that in development, we're aiming ultimately for a systems transformation. Every now and then, I think we hear about changing organizations. But what I'm hearing very interestingly in this idea about some people being more receptive to change is that change might have something to do with individuals. And I have to say that it's not very often that I see development programs so squarely focused on changing individuals and their orientation to change. I don't know, is that a fair comment to make?
I guess, no, absolutely. So I do think we need to focus a lot more on changing the mindset with individuals. And I think that is probably also the good link with the next speaker I think we have in mind, who can tell us more about the change within organizations.
Absolutely. And I think we've got something from the chat here, which is this notion that there is an additional aspect, which is about de-risking costs of innovation for companies. Bernardo, you introduced that idea. Perhaps you want to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's also something that we saw that worked in Burkina Dry more with a few of the companies. So obviously the first exports of a new product that they don't have like the supply chain figured out and the process figured out can be quite costly for them. Also because they feel like there's a significant risk, so they try to price that new product quite high, which makes it uncompetitive in the market, especially for a commodity like ginger. So what we did was also to subsidize the price difference between the price that is expected from the company that was purchasing, from the importer, and the price expectation also from our or beneficiary company, so that cost of innovation would fall on the project side. The company still would make a profit, and the importer would get their products with the price that they expected. Obviously, this is not a sustainable in the long run approach, because there's not always a project to subsidize, but the idea was to get them going, give it a first try, so that they process the ginger, so they reach out to the importer, that they establish that relationship, and hopefully as they improve their processes and their supply chain, that would bring the cost down with the buyer expectations, and so then they would not need the subsidy anymore. And so that's also an approach that I think it was not initially planned, but then when we realized that it was a bit more challenging to bring them in the innovation, we decided to put in place to allow them to experiment and also to trial, and that's what we were speaking earlier about, this trial and error approach. Then if they are not satisfied, they may just stop altogether, right? But at least there was a first step in that direction.
Absolutely. I can definitely see how making that co-investment can perhaps help them over a final hurdle. And that's quite a useful practical intervention that we can do as practitioners. I'm also very much interested in this notion of risk. If you know me, you'll know that I'm also on a bit of a journey to becoming a certified coach. And I think what I have discovered is that there is a certain human element around risk, that we sometimes think about the commercial risk, but I wonder how often we think about the personal risk. You know, you're an entrepreneur going about your business, you're in a very a factory that's functioning well, the processes are in place. You know, it's a well-oiled machine. You don't wake up every morning with uncertainty. And now we say, okay, innovate, and the entire process is going to be jagged and painful and filled with failure and the potential for failure. So, you know, there's definitely this very human bit that I think we don't always address. Okay, so I think that we're at a point now where we've been bringing all these different strands together, and it's really important for us now to start looking at how we can actually practically drive these changes, how we can perhaps address some of the personal changes, the individual changes, the organizational changes in a more thoughtful and intentional fashion. So joining us on the call today is Marlon, a change management practitioner, who's going to bring some of his practical experience to this topic, especially as it applies to the private sector. And perhaps we can learn some practical tools and approaches which we can then apply in our context. So welcome, Marlon.
Well, thank you very much.
Great. So Marlon, you know, we've been talking about how difficult it is to get people to change. And I'm quite curious, you know, why is there this resistance to change?
Okay, the first thing that comes to mind in answering that question is the fact that these individuals weren't involved in the change. They weren't, as Michael indicated earlier, from inception, they had not been taken along on the journey, right? So you'd be able to, had you approached it differently, I mean, each and every project starts with an idea. And if you do not take the people along with you, you are going to meet up with different types of people, different characteristics. You're going to be able to identify different behaviors within these people, and merely because they weren't taken along. So if you are going into an environment and you're enforcing a change without consulting the individuals, from the very word go, in taking into mind that with each and every project, it starts with people change and it ends with people change. So the people are the core of each and every project, and they therefore need to be consulted, either as stakeholders, as employees, as impacted individuals. They need to be kept. I see that I've been okay. I've been muted. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. No, within this, just having some difficulty because it's popping up and saying that I've been muted. Let me
No.
carry on.
Mhm.
Maybe there's someone that doesn't like to, what I'm saying, you know. So,
Not at all. Please continue.
yeah. So that is why there's resistance most of the time, because it's enforced onto people,
Mm.
and they are therefore forced to align themselves to these changes that are to be implemented and made within their environments, and that is why.